start with Ms. Jimenez. I've had the pleasure of meeting you before, and it's good to see you again.
Thank you very much, and I want to say how much we appreciate the effort that's gone into this public hearing and holding it, and in particular the effort that's gone into hearing from such a wide variety of stakeholders. We feel that there really are many, and I think that you have a great representation of all the key stakeholders who really have a vested interest in what comes of this public hearing and the national transportation system as we move forward. It is a pleasure to be here. I thank you for affording us the opportunity. On behalf of the City of Chicago, Mayor Daley, the Chicago Department of Transportation, and certainly rail users across the state of Illinois, thank you for holding this public hearing and for addressing the issue, trying to look at the issues of rail capacity and infrastructure needs. You know, for almost 150 years, Chicago has been the rail hub of the world. And I think that a lot of people don't understand that because we seem to be landlocked in the center of the country. Today we have more than 1,200 trains coming and going from the Chicago region on a daily basis. And we truly can be called a rail crossroads for the United States. Chicago remains the busiest rail gateway in the entire U.S. And we've heard huge numbers today about cargo and what's being used just from the ports themselves, both on the east and on the west coast. The rail system in the Chicago region supports more than 38,000 jobs and a $1.7 billion in annual wages. We support $22 billion in annual economic value to the region's manufacturers and businesses. And I look forward to hearing more from the businesses that are dependent and reliant upon rail. Increasing capacity has to be linked also to increasing efficiency in our rail system. It bolsters not only the Chicago and Illinois economy, but our national economy. The City of Chicago has always had a very strong appreciation for and a vested interest in the role that freight railroads play in the nation's transportation system, and the importance not only to our regional and but to our national economy as well. We're concerned about the future of the rail industry just for that reason. I'm here today because of that concern. The Chicago region is the largest transit point for international freights, and we've just heard about what the growth demand looks like on international intermodal containers that will be coming to North America in the next 20 years. 1/3 of the nation's freight rail moves through Chicago. We in Chicago receive approximately 60% of all of the cargo that's shipped into Los Angeles and to Long Beach. We receive more than half of the freight that goes to the Seattle and Tacoma ports as well. We've had the pleasure of visiting both with city officials and with port officials all along the West Coast, both with LA, Long Beach, with Seattle, with the ports of Tacoma. We've also been to New York and to New Jersey. And it is without question that all of us have to think more globally. We have to understand that we're a part of a global trade market at this point. And the good news is that there is a growing demand. The good news is that the forecast for growth in our over the next 30 years on an annual basis will be almost 3%. At this rate, the demand for freight transportation, has been pointed out by a number of the presenters, is going to double before we get to 2035. That's something like freight demand growing 15 billion tons today to about 29 billion tons in less than 30 years. The economic growth, including population and trade growth, will generate 14 billion additional tons of freight to move across this country from one side to the other. As we've just heard, the intermodal business also is projected to maintain growth on an annual basis. And the question becomes, can we keep up with the growing demand? Can we keep up with the growing demand? And what's going to be the impact even if we did? And who is it that's going to be impacted? Because not only is that increased volume and tonnage that's coming, but it's increased ton miles. It's an increase in longer distances that freight's going to be traveling. The extent of our capacity constraints. In the AASHTO report, it's estimated that the Class 1 railroads could not afford from their current revenue streams to pay for building all the infrastructure that will be required to keep up with this amount of demand. That they may only be able to meet as little as 1/2 of that demand. So where does the unmet need get filled? It's likely to shift we know, to trucks and to our highway system, causing additional deterioration of our highway system. The report estimated that to keep pace with the economic growth and maintain its current share of freight tonnage, the railroads needed to make investments in almost $200 million over the next 20 years in capital investments. The lack of rail capacity is a key factor in shifting freight from rail to trucks. The new demands for rail service will increase, though, the wear and tear on our nation's road service, and will have an incredible cost to them as well. The railroads will invest and expand services in the profitable markets and not all of the markets. It has to make good business sense. We understand that, and we support the investment of the railroads. But the lack of rail capacity is no longer limited to a few choke points around the country or to a few hubs, but the utilized corridors. It's a nationwide problem affecting almost all of the nation's critical, important gateways, rail hubs, and intercity freight corridors. And as far as we know, there's no uniform or comprehensive data for assessment of the physical condition and the current capacity of the national rail system. What we all know is that our rail infrastructure is aging. We also see in a city like Chicago the increased deterioration of rail infrastructure, whether it's viaducts in neighborhoods or rail yards around our city. What we also see is a rail infrastructure that's approaching 150 years old and needs major improvements, major investments to keep up with the demand of capacity and to build the efficiencies that we need in the rail system. The ability of the railroads to meet the rising demands. Freight rail has trouble keeping pace with growing demands in Chicago. Goods formerly shipped by rail are being diverted to trucks and increasing traffic on not only our congested Illinois highways, but on our streets in the city of Chicago and in other streets in other cities. Although we feel that there is much better coordination today of the rail managers in our 6 Class 1 railroads in Chicago, the investment in the infrastructure can hardly keep up with the fast pace and the growing demand of rail freight coming into Chicago. If rail cannot maintain its share of freight, the impacts, of course, as we've all heard today and we all know, are increased congestion on the highways and on our city streets and in our neighborhoods, a higher cost of doing business for having to track further away, a higher cost of living to those who are impacted by living near rail, and increasing environmental degradations in our neighborhoods and in our cities. Rail should be one of the most vital components of our nation's rail transportation system. We do not want to see more freight rail being offloaded onto trucks and onto our highways. So what are some of the solutions? What are the things that we come to you today to propose? We think that it is really time that all of us think about one national transportation system. Instead of thinking about individual cities, Chicago, LA, Long Beach, Seattle, Tacoma, New York, New Jersey, we ought to be thinking about one national rail system. For example, over the next 3 years, in the CREATE program, we'll build a total of 13 improvement projects through our CREATE program that are directly connected to the service, the rail system in Washington State. So by building and thinking nationally, by thinking about how the Seattle port is impacted by its ability to get freight rail to us, to Chicago, through Chicago, or to stay there, we have to be thinking about where our investment should go. And I'm here to tell you today that 13 of the projects being built in the next 3 years will help improve efficiency between Seattle and Chicago. That's the way we need to think. Businesses on the Northwest Coast and shippers that are relying on the railroads need to see and to experience the direct benefit from the investments in infrastructure in Chicago. And we all need to understand the connections and the ties between city to city, port to port. Because we're connected to these cities, we need to be working on this national rail coordinated effort to address building capacity and efficiency. It should address the worst bottlenecks. It should also set priorities and think and act beyond city, county, and state boundaries. We believe there are currently no comprehensive rail system expansion strategies at the national level who will help keep us growing the capacity to meet future demand. As was mentioned today, the Heartland Corridor allows freight to move, will allow freight to move double-stacked. It's moving faster. It'll bring volume, but it'll take it where? It'll take it to other hubs, other rail hubs like Chicago, that unless we've anticipated and unless we've built the capacity at the other end of the line, it will also sit there and wait until we can afford the time to actually handle it. I would like to say that the Create Public-Private Partnership is one of the solutions to developing, I think, the national freight rail system. Chicago's Create is a model for a public-private partnership where both the state, the city, and the federal railroads are, the federal government is contributing to building capacity and efficiency. Of 78 projects that the Create program will build, we're going to realize at least $595 million in benefits related to rail passengers, motorists, safety, improved environmental air quality, and other benefits. And the environmental benefits alone will be over $1 billion. The investment we make with Create is paramount in keeping the nation's most critical rail terminal working and contributing to the nation's economy and a healthy environment. Quality of life for cities is critical, and railroads run through city and serve cities and businesses. So in a national dialogue, the cities and the states need also to have a voice at the table. Being ready for the future requires a comprehensive national freight capacity expansion plan that we should all be working on. In addition to establishing a national rail policy to set priorities and to address bottlenecks and issues, we believe we should increase private and public investment in freight and passenger rail systems to increase the capacity of rail in the national transportation system. Private and public investment both are needed. However, the public sector should have a say-so and be at the table to guide the investments to ensure there are direct public benefits. Third, we should support the improvement of urban rail operations to preserve rail service, reducing the truck traffic and minimizing community impacts. While Class I railroads have been most successful in expanding mainline capacities, it's not as easy to do so in a large metropolitan area. We need to work together to address those issues. So how do we pay for it? How do we fund such investments in developing an answer to demand, being ready for the future? We believe that funding grants and credit programs for public participation in public benefit projects, including dual benefit freight and passenger rail improvements, is important. In addition to the current TIFIA and RIF programs, we think that tax credit bond programs should be considered as well. Tax credits can be used to expand investments by shippers and industries supported by rail. Consider a separate national freight program in the next surface transportation reauthorization bill. And Chairman, you were just talking about that. Should it still be combined with the highway tax bill? Support and promote full funding for rail infrastructure safety improvement programs, one that we think is critical to dealing with grade crossing separation issues in urban settings and urban areas. Again, I'd say that we need to think more globally and act nationally, not locally and nationally, but globally and nationally. It's a different world today than what it was 150 years ago when rail was built in the city of Chicago. The problem is that we're still looking at the infrastructure of 150 years ago. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Jimenez. Mr. Stolnik, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chairman Nottingham, Vice Chairman Buttry, Commissioner Mulvey. Again, my name is Chuck Spitolnik. I'm with the firm Kaplan, Kirsch & Rockwell, the D.C. office here, and we have the privilege and pleasure of representing the Regional Transportation District in their negotiation with the railroads with respect to the implementation of the Fast Tracks project that's described in somewhat more detail in the testimony that we submitted. RTD is a political subdivision of the state of Colorado that serves a total of 8 counties in the Denver, Colorado region. RTD appreciates the opportunity to present its comments to the board today on issues related to capacity and infrastructure needs in the nation's rail system. RTD has explained in the testimony we filed previously in this proceeding, and you've heard also this morning from a representative of the American Public Transportation Association about the issues that rail transit providers face. Transit agencies like RTD have as their goal the improvement of the quality of life and increasing investment potential in the regions that we serve. Creating alternatives to automobile use improves access to areas of cities where jobs are located or are being created, improves air quality, improves the commuting experience, and benefits the public in a host of tangible and intangible ways. The purpose of this hearing, according to the board's March 6th notice, is to gather information about capacity issues and about the ability of the railroads to meet increasing demand for their infrastructure. RTD is participating here today to reinforce to this board that the needs of commuters in regions and the commuting public in regions like Denver require consideration as part of the calculus for meeting demand for use of the rail infrastructure. When RTD approaches railroads about the use of their property, we're not looking for a handout. Rather, we seek a reasonable assessment of the cost of accommodating our systems, reasonable requirements for infrastructure improvements, and reasonable requirements for insurance and indemnification. By requiring the railroads to approach these issues in a reasonable way, this board can serve the public interest in the efficient use of the existing infrastructure. By requiring railroads to report on their plans for capacity enhancements and by conducting an independent assessment of the availability of right-of-way for use by rail transit systems, as RTD has requested in the testimony that we filed, this board can take a further step towards fulfilling its mandate to serve the public interest in use of that right-of-way for the public good. Thank you very much for your consideration of the points that RTD has made in its written testimony and today, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have, and I hope you'll make your 7 o'clock trains.
Thank you, Mr. Stolnik. We always appreciate concise presentations, and of course, everyone's entire statements will be put in the record. Just as a housekeeping matter, we will need to be closely monitoring the time allocations and following the yellow and red lights as we approach the evening hours today. So, with that, questions, Ms. Jimenez. Clearly, you don't need to convince this board of the importance of the CREATE project. You've seen us all out there walking the project, and the the challenge clearly is getting the money lined up at this point and getting the work done. In that vein, do you worry how big a challenge is it the fact that the way transportation finance has generally worked has been a sort of what I'll call pay-as-you-go. You get the entire phase of the project funded, and then you start that phase, as opposed to more of a debt-financed model where you can figure out a way to collect fees over time and issue debt, and then pay, because you're basically fixing a 100-plus-year-old problem right now, and you're having to convince your taxpayers and others, the state and the city and the railroads and others, to fork up the money to all at once, sort of all at once. I mean, it's a phased project with increments, but to fix a 100-plus-year problem. Are there any ideas on how you can sort of lessen the sting of that and spread it out over time?
The challenge to us in the CREATE program, to all the stakeholders, has been to set priorities with the resources that we have. Of the 78 projects that we need to build, over the next 3 years. We have a 3-year plan where we will be building 32 of those projects. It's 40% of the projects with 20% of the funding that we have available. What was most important was selecting the projects whereby we would find the highest benefits, where congestion would be relieved, relief was necessary, where 911 crossings really need to be freed up, where grade crossing separations that are holding up police and fire and ambulances. Those are critical projects where we have businesses such as Ford Motor Company on the south side of the city of Chicago agreed to locate their supplier park across the street, brought in 1,400 new jobs to the city of Chicago. But right now the railroads are crossing between, and just-in-time delivery doesn't happen just in time. So setting it as a priority to build that project, to hold jobs in this region, and to make sure that businesses that are relying on us were top priorities as we set out our three-year plan. It also helps us, we feel, to demonstrate that we're being good stewards of the dollars that we have, and that the benefits will help the rest of the country and certainly Congress to see that a wise investment with good benefits is worth investing in again. So we're hoping that setting priorities will help us leverage additional dollars. People who live in the city who see the benefits of being able to get to work on time, being able to cross safely, also garners their support to continue on with projects like this. I must say that CREATE and other corridor type projects like this are generally, as in our city, just the beginning. It is 78 projects, but it's not the end all for the investments that need to be made. So continually looking for revenue streams that will support this is critical to us.
Thanks. Mr. Spitolnik, in your statement, it mentions that the STB should consider requiring rail carriers to accommodate public passenger service. You talked about right-of-way opportunities that exist in certain corridors where a freight railroad may only be using a portion of its right-of-way at the current time, and there are enormous local and regional needs for access for transit. Walk me through kind of how that would work in your view from a compensation perspective, a private property rights perspective, and then kind of would we then create a almost an entitlement where when the railroad announces they need to go to their long-planned triple tracking and disrupt the transit service, there's not an insurrection where they get chased out of town?
Well, start with the compensation. The compensation piece of that puzzle begins to address the other issues that you raised. As I said, when RTD approaches the railroads with whom it wants to form a partnership, it doesn't go to them just saying, well, give me what you got and I'll take it and use it. We understand that it's valuable resources that we have to compensate the owners, for which we have to compensate the owners. At the time that there's any kind of a transaction like that, a railroad, if it has the triple tracking plan in place that you just postulated, needs to say, well, we've got this long-term plan in place, and this is how we propose to use our facilities in the future, and this is why we think we're going to get there, and this is why your plan is going to present a problem, and there needs to be a give and take there ought to be a give and take if there's really a public interest in the preservation or the creation of a commuter rail system in that community. There ought to be a give and take about when that's going to happen, how you're going to pay for and accommodate the infrastructure needs at the time that the infrastructure needs actually arise. And there's no, I can't walk you through it, on a step-by-step basis because no one of them is going to be exactly the same. It really requires careful, honest assessment on the part of both parties as to what the existing needs are, what the future needs are, what the projected plans are, and starting to be able to determine how to best use the resource, which is, yes, privately owned, but has a public purpose associated with it, and to try to address compensation needs appropriately. And I think that process addresses the other steps that were part of the question that you posed. If not, then I'll try to do more.
I will say certainly in other contexts, the board, our agency does have some experience in valuation
Exactly.
proceedings. And would you be comfortable with the board basically making some type of fair market value assessment? Because public interest obviously is awfully important, but it's hard to know what to punch in the old calculator under the public interest heading to make it all square up with the railroad?
Well, the board has, and its predecessor, the SEC, of course, has spent a great deal of time formulating valuation methodologies to figure out how to compensate an owner of track for use of that track or use of that right-of-way by another party. And there are methodologies out there that, that can be looked at, and that not only RTD but other members of the transit community have been willing to talk with the railroads about developing and codifying and making part of the regulatory process. And I'm not sure that necessarily fair market value is the right answer, but it's the discussion about how to appropriately compensate the railroads for use of their right-of-way is something that needs to begin, so that there's a national standard for it, rather than each agency, as you heard Mr. Zahner refer to this morning, each agency have to start from scratch when they go to approach the various railroads in their locales.
Thank you. Vice Chairman Buttry?
I'd just like to ask, in the city of Chicago, does one of those, you said 78 projects,
That's correct.
is one of those projects any kind of cure for the infamous four-way stop there in the south side of Chicago for the railroads?
I believe, Vice Chairman, you're speaking of the Brighton Park cross where all trains have to stop. In fact,
There's eight tracks there, and they all have to come to a screeching halt, no matter what.
Every train has to stop. Yes, on July 9th, the final installations of all of the signals for that four-way stop will have been installed, and trains will no longer, there will be a grand announcement about that, because at that point then trains will no longer have to come to a screeching halt there.
So the little guy, the little shack there at the four-way stop goes away.
We're looking for another job for him.
Good. I hope you find one for him. He's been doing a great job.
Yes. It is.
Same as you meant, the Smithsonian might be a good place for that shack.
Yeah, that's a great
Right here in
idea.
the neighborhood.
I thought of that. Those old signals that have been there for 1,000 years, ought to end up in some museum somewhere.
I'm sure they will, some rail museum. However, I want you to know that is one of 14 in the region. It certainly has been our poster child, and we're very happy to say that construction and installation of the signaling is going on as we speak, and will be finished by July 9th.
July 9th.
Yes.
I bet the mayor will be out there for that, don't you think?
He will be applauding with everyone else, and we are on mission to get rid of the other 13.
That's good. What percentage of those 78 projects are what I would refer to as grade crossing type projects, or any of them grade crossing projects?
There are 25 grade crossing separations in the project. There are 6 major passenger flyovers that will separate our commuters from our freight rail, and 47 that are freight rail infrastructure projects that will help improve the flow and the efficiency and movement of freight rail.
And you can't do that for $100 million.
No, sir. We are doing value engineering wherever we can. We're looking for the opportunities to come in, of course, on budget or under budget if we can. However, the concern, as the chairman raised, how do you keep these revenue streams coming? And every day that goes by, the cost of steel, the cost of the materials going into these projects continues to soar.
Well, I applaud your efforts to do so much with so little.
Thank you.
Commissioner Mulvey?
Thank you. I had the pleasure of appearing before your legislative commission on rail on Monday of this week on the CREATE project, and I'm glad to see that you're continuing to pursue it. But quite frankly, with the failure to generate the sufficient amount of federal dollars, the project had to be scaled back. And when you got all this agreement between the 6 large railroads, the state, the local government, the federal government, Amtrak, Metra, as to who would have what responsibility, when you have to scale back from $1.5 billion, $300 and some odd million, clearly you have to pick and choose amongst the projects that you're going to do, and then not all the participants who had agreed to what their fair share was of the $1.5 billion necessarily agree with the new allocation or the new project selection. Have you had a problem holding the coalition together since you've had to go back and sort of put this thing in tranches as opposed to going ahead with the whole $1.5 billion project?
No. The railroads, of course, looking at the $100 million that they are currently investing in these projects, along with the city and the state, we went through a process of evaluating which projects could actually have the environmental work done, have design done, and actually be constructed over the next 3-year period. So by the time, if there's a reauthorization of the transportation bill, we could actually say these are the ones that have these benefits that we were in fact able to construct during this time. An evaluation process occurred where all of the stakeholders were at the table agreeing on which projects would be done. The freight rail infrastructure improvements are the lion's share of the first part of this, first phase of this, and the railroads helped to put together or selected which ones they felt would be the most beneficial in developing added efficiency and moving around the Chicago rail terminal.
Okay. The CREATE project, like the Alameda Code, has been sort of a poster child for public-private partnerships for rail infrastructure improvements and solving local urban problems at the same time. I know a lot of places are interested in what is going on in Chicago and what your experience has been. Have you been in contact with other cities, localities? Houston comes to mind, Fort Worth and others who have similar problems, who'd like to look and see what you have done and how you've gone about putting together the CREATE project and how they may learn from your experiences?
We have, as I said, we have gone to New York, to New Jersey, to LA, Long Beach, and Seattle, and met with Seattle and Tacoma there. We believe that networking cities are a huge part of the answer, of setting priorities, of looking at bottlenecks. We want to expand that network and are certainly continuing our efforts to contact other cities, and we'll be doing that. To really set some priorities, we hope, work together to really look at one national freight rail system to set priorities. Again, you know, which competing with one another for funding, limited funds for corridor projects or for major national projects, they need to be done. But we need to set some priorities, and I think that cities at the table working together can be a powerful voice and force in helping to set those priorities. And we would certainly, again, I think your public hearing brings a kind of attention that we need to this kind of effort that needs to be undertaken. And we certainly want to work with our elected officials to also educate and work to find funding resources and set priorities together. So,
thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, Vice Chairman Buttrey? Thank you. That concludes this panel. Thank you very much for being here today. We'll bring up the next panel, a large panel of coal shippers and utilities, panel number 7.
So I'm just going to go. He doesn't. He works there. Oh, there he is. Here. The only one. Okay. Once you pull them,
Tom, I think you're here. We short a chair?
no, we need a computer.
Oh, okay. We need one more chair, though.
We'll come over when it's our turn. We're still going to need a chair. Try to minimize the trouble.
Now you've confused us. You've got to switch your cards.
You got enough room there? I'm not.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome. We'll proceed with panel 7. We're pleased today to have a distinguished group of representatives of the coal shipping and utility community. Mr. Gary Voigt of the Arkansas Electric Cooperative Corporation, Mr. Michael Loftus and Andrew Colasar from Concerned Captive Coal Shippers, Mr. William Mold from Edison Electric Institute, Betsy Monsu from the Foundation Energy Sales, Thomas Cantor from the National Coal Transportation Association, and Thomas Crowley and Peter Full from the Western Coal Traffic League. We're delighted to have all of you here with us today, and I believe we're going to start with Mr. Voigt.
Thank you, Chairman Nottingham, Board Member Mulvey, and Mr. Vice Chairman, when he returns. I am Gary Vogt with Arkansas Electric Cooperatives. AECC is a generation and transmission cooperative that serves 17 distribution members in Arkansas who ultimately serve about 460,000 consumers across the state. They serve in each of the 75 counties and operate about 60,000 miles of distribution facilities to perform that task. Our interest in rail issues is the fact that we rely heavily on Powder River Basin coal. Most of our generation, matter of fact, in a normal year, 85% of our generation comes from coal. The three plants that we have a partial ownership in were designed to depend 100% on PRB coal, and about 9% of our generation resources come from hydro. So I say normal because we have to go back to 2004 in order to find a normal year for our operations. The well-documented problems in May of 2005 with disruptions of the PRB coal probably had the distinction of having the biggest impact percentage-wise on our system of just about any utility that you could find out there. We saw over a 20-year trend declining prices for our members, literally 40% reduction in real dollars. A big portion of that attributed to efficiency of the railroads, reduced transportation costs, reduced PRB coal costs. While I recall your mention of being toast, that we had reliability problems associated in the 80 to 90% range. We have about 99.96% reliability. If we performed like the railroads did for a 19-month period, we'd have to turn off the power about 3.5 hours every day. We literally had 80 to 90% of the required coal transportation for a 19-month period. In that time, we increased our wholesale cost to our members about 25%. So I thought I was going to be toast at the end of that first year of operation with those kind of increases. We continue to have impacts because we're bringing in addition to the PRB coal that's available via rail, barge traffic from Colombian coal, Indonesian coal, and to a smaller extent some local coal resources out of Colorado that are increasing our coal production costs by about 20% in today's dollar. So we clearly have an interest in the infrastructure issues that you're dealing with here. Particularly when we look at the rhetoric that's really been advanced regarding the capacity and infrastructure issues, it raises a couple of very critical questions. We believe that the position advanced by the railroads indicate that there really is a reduction in competitive pressure, and if so, is the board going to have to take a different action? We believe the answer is, in fact, yes, that there are different actions required. Because the PRB coal shippers have had concerns with the competitive conduct of the Western railroads, the movement toward public pricing seems to be have coincided with a reduction in real head-to-head rail competition. We think the railroads are saying they really can't make the investments that will be needed to handle future volume, so we should expect rates to go up even higher. We expect to pay an appropriate rate of return for the investments that are required in order to serve the PRB shipments. In our written submissions, we basically find that you really can't support the theory. On the theory side, there's a claim that railroad unit costs are going up as a result of volume increases, and that really undermines the basic economies of scale. It wipes out the real economic rationale that's really been the basis for past regulatory decisions, and that we'll need to I think the board will need to revisit a number of significant competitive precedents if that turns out to be the case. If you look at PRB coal, it's going to grow based on DOE estimates of about 1.8% per year in the future. We think that and clearly that growth rate is almost the same as the overall rate of productivity improvements that the railroads have experienced. And if you look at the productivity improvements, the planned improvements in the PRB shipments, then we expect that there should be adequate capacity to continue at least that level of performance, an appropriate level of performance in the PRB. Now, the railroads have confirmed this morning that the shippers play a critical role in increasing the capacity coming out of the PRB, and that an example, if you look at the UP's recent achieved increase in average tons per coal year, it was greater than the average annual growth. for PRB, meaning that in year 2 that we could ship more tons of fewer cars and train movements, and that ultimately the railroads could accommodate increased volume and in fact rely on investments in new rail cars made by coal shippers, and maybe even provide some additional capacity outside of the PRB coal shipments without additional cost. And we believe that there's a need, the capacity won't be supplied unless we're really talking about a reduction in competition, that there potentially is a reduction in competition that's going to affect it. The combination of reducing investments and increasing rates may look to the financial community. The combination may look good to the financial community of reducing rates and reducing investment and increasing rates, but it is a textbook result of allowing exercise of too much market power. We therefore offer a collection of modest proposals for things that the board should do to restore competitive pressures and enhance capacity while getting railroad management, giving management the latitude that it needs for it to take a longer-term view of infrastructure needs. And we think that's entirely compatible with the shipper's needs, is the longer-term view that is required. Number one is of the options is streamline the process of construction applications. The fact that the amount of money and time that DME took in order to get approval for the recent project is enough to make it pretty much impossible for rational business people to try to enter into that business in the future because of the potential risks that exist there. We think that implementing new criteria that support investment to the extent possible, the board should encourage build-outs and other projects that increase competition, flexibility, and ultimately increase capacity of the rail system. We think that the shippers are going to be innovative or willing to be innovative in providing additional financing and investments where appropriate to enhance the reliability of the system, and we don't think that necessarily we've gotten a good reception from a review of all of those possibilities in the past. I think we need to alter the competitive access criteria to increase effective capacity, changing the bottleneck criteria, elimination of the paper barriers, along with relaxation of terminal access and reciprocal switching standards will allow market forces to shift traffic flows where appropriate. Facilitating withdrawal from the rail bank. Processes could be put in place and policies altered to make it easier to restore line to active service that has been rail banked. And facilitating cooperative action. Steps could be taken to facilitate the cooperative use of rail facilities to increase the throughput capacity of the system and restore capacity loss to past mergers. The board's reconsideration of past mergers could permit restoration of duplicate or previously unneeded capacity to restore competition or increase capacity. In closing, I think it's important to note that what we're advocating does not undermine legitimate policy reasons for providing investment tax credits in the future. There are a lot of sound reasons that have been discussed before, including quality, air quality, fuel use, and reduced highway capacity. If they're to be implemented, it may be appropriate for investment tax credits to be used on such issues, but further, it would also be wise if those are linked to investments that should be made for requirement to compete, and so that the use of these new facilities could be used for competitive purposes and allow a duplicate use of facilities to cure some of the market power issues, and also should be targeted to reduce the frequency of incidents and the disruptions of rail service that have been prevalent over the past. As regarding the public interest in rail matters, it is appropriate and necessary for the board to use its authority to ensure the railroads fulfill their public service obligation and make the necessary investments to meet the shipper's requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boyd. We'll now proceed with Mr. Loftus. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman Nottingham, Vice Chairman Buttry, Commissioner Mulvey. My name is Michael Loftus. I'm an attorney with the law firm Slover & Loftus, and it's my pleasure to appear in this matter on behalf of the Concerned Captive Coal Shippers Group. Participants in that group in this matter include the American Electric Power Service Corporation, Duke Energy Corporation, the Intermountain Power Project, Progress Energy, Seminole Electric Power Cooperative, Inc., and South Carolina Public Service Authority. Each of these companies ships large volumes of coal by rail in circumstances where there is no effective competition for their traffic. The concerned coal shippers thank the board for its initiative in scheduling this hearing to examine important issues of rail capacity and infrastructure requirements, and for allowing us to appear and provide comments. There are several points addressed in our written comments that we wish to stress briefly. First, adequate rail capacity and infrastructure are critical to coal-burning electric utilities. Coal shippers depend heavily on the railroads for transportation of huge volumes of coal to their power plants. For most coal plants, there is simply no practical alternative to rail transportation for delivery of coal. Coal-fired plants are generally base-load, must-run generating assets that play a vital role in meeting ever-increasing demands for electric power. Reliable operation of the nation's electric grid requires reliable transportation of coal, which in turn requires adequate rail capacity and infrastructure. Second, coal shippers in both the East and the West have suffered in recent years from periods of poor rail service in circumstances where inadequate capacity seems clearly to have been a major cause. Due to very slow cycle times for unit trains and the unavailability of loading permits or loading slots or rail cars for additional train sets to offset the impact of deteriorating cycle times, utilities have experienced shrinking coal stockpiles as normal coal burns have exceeded rail deliveries of coal. When coal stockpiles are reduced below safe levels due to inadequate rail deliveries, coal-fired generation must be curtailed, and higher cost generation or purchased power must be substituted at great cost to utilities and their customers. Such curtailments can also raise serious reliability concerns for individual utilities and interconnected systems. Third, the rail industry is currently enjoying strong financial performance. In our written comments, we have cited some of the many sources that confirm this. Concerned coal shippers submits that one of the major reasons for that circumstance is the large increases in rail rates that have been imposed on coal transportation, especially for captive movements. Coal traffic is more than paying its fair share of the railroad's revenue requirements generally and specifically for rail infrastructure. As the 2003 AASHTO report found, due to the large volume and high profitability of coal traffic, the railroads, under any of the scenarios they looked at, should be able to expand and maintain sufficient rail infrastructure and capacity to handle increasing coal volumes. 4, because of the high level of coal rates, as the board considers the railroad's rail infrastructure investment requirements, the board should be attentive to the need to prevent cross-subsidization by coal traffic of other rail traffic. The standalone cost methodology as applied by the board is not an effective means of protection against cross-subsidization. 5, there is a clear relationship between railroad capacity and competition between and among railroads. Where capacity is constrained, railroads are less concerned about competition and have a freer hand to demand higher rates. In its October 2006 report to Congress, GAO expressed its view that the STB should analyze the state of competition in the rail industry and possible abuses of market power. We submit that the board should be mindful of these concerns as it evaluates the adequacy of railroad infrastructure. Finally, because of the importance of timely and reliable rail transportation for coal, the concerned coal shippers urge the board to pursue its inquiry beyond this initial hearing. In particular, we ask that the board require the railroads to demonstrate the current and projected relationship of the demand for rail service to rail capacity. We also ask that as you examine these issues, you be mindful of the need to avoid cross-subsidization by coal shippers, that you consider the extent to which capacity constraints may be attributable to the railroad's failure to expand capacity in advance of increasing demand despite their financial ability to do so, and that you consider the adverse impacts of constrained capacity on competition among the railroads. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Loftus. Now we hear from Mr. Moll.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. My name is Bill Moll. I work with Entergy Services. On behalf of the Edison Electric Institute, its members, Entergy Services, and the Entergy operating companies, I'd like to thank the board for taking the time to provide shippers with the opportunity to address concerns relating to railroad infrastructure issues, particularly as they relate to utility shippers. Entergy is a large purchaser of PRB coal and currently purchases about 15 million tons a year. I'd like to say at the outset that both EEI and Entergy recognize that the railroad's investments and growth in the PRB and other portions of their systems have been impressive. I also like to say that we fully support the railroads. We want the railroads to be financially viable. We also support an investment tax credit, assuming there's appropriate accountability for the railroads tied to that investment tax credit. The reason we're here today is that many of the improvements that are touted by the railroads have not been fully reflected in deliveries to their utility customers. We have serious concerns as an industry that what the railroads are proclaiming is a dramatic recovery from and cure of the energy-related service woes of 2005 have left untold infrastructure weaknesses and vulnerabilities which will continue to plague America's energy sector and the U.S. economy. As I will explain more fully to the board in the following comments, these concerns fall roughly into three general areas. First, many of the overall averages and investment numbers being proclaimed by the railroad industry do not necessarily reflect or ensure service improvement to all regions. The railroads use these overall averages or system statistics to portray a picture of improvement which does not in fact exist in many regions. Increased coal tonnages being publicized by the railroads generally as compared to the disastrous year of 2005 do not necessarily mean that all requirements are being met. Much of the increased tonnages reported by carriers in 2006 and 2007 are being achieved by adding more and more train sets instead of improving train velocity, thus leaving us concerned that the rail system is significantly fragile and vulnerable to further disruptions. A recent industry publication quoted a representative from BN saying that BNSF believes there is sufficient capacity on the joint line to accommodate the needs of existing customers, as well as new customers who recognize the value of PRB coal delivered to their facilities. The article goes on to say that BNSF reviews demand and adjusts capacity expansion plans as appropriate to make sure that there is sufficient capacity on the joint line to meet that demand. The joint line is only one of the factors that influence the problems that we've incurred in terms of rail deliveries to our facilities. It's a well-known fact that intermodal traffic is highly prized and prioritized by the railroads, and this traffic obviously can have adverse impacts on coal deliveries to power plants due to congestion. For example, in mid-2006, when the railroads were publicly proclaiming their recovery from the 2005 service levels from the PRB to various regions, those actual shipments varied greatly. Although some of the regions were experiencing year-to-date PRB shipments at levels of 10 to 20% over 2005 volumes, other regions were seeing much smaller improvements, and in some cases less than 2005. A prime example is the rail deliveries to our Nelson plant located near Lake Charles, Louisiana. Deliveries to this plant are dependent on rail shipments through Kansas City or through Texas, usually through the Dallas-Fort Worth and Houston metroplexes. During the course of 2006, these deliveries had cycle times substantially worse than the contractual commitment levels and worse than the historical performance prior to 2005. So despite BNSF's claims there's adequate capacity, Entergy only received about 86% of its overall nominated requirements for the Nelson plant in 2006 and continues to experience difficulties due to bottlenecks across the system in 2007. Although in 2007 some utilities are finally seeing some signs of recovery by the railroads in certain regions, concerns remain that the system is very fragile and unable to recover from shortfalls. This can be noted by the significant number of force majeure events that have been claimed by the railroads over the last 2 years. Entergy's seen more force majeure events claimed over the last 2 years compared to the last 20 years combined. Another indication that there's inadequate infrastructure and capacity to meet our needs as an electric utility. As a prudent utility with an obligation to serve its electricity customers, Entergy finds itself compelled to continue to purchase a substantial amount of coal from alternate sources in order to ensure a reliable supply of coal to maximize the output of its base load coal-fired generating resources. During 2006, for example, Entergy had to purchase more than 950,000 tons of coal from alternate domestic and foreign resources at a delivered cost of approximately 2 to 3 times that of PRB coal. A simple example is we are currently importing coal into our Nelson facility, where we bring large ships into the port of Lake Charles, unload those ships onto docks, and then load up trucks to truck that coal over to our Nelson plant. This not only creates safety issues, environmental issues, but it is also done at a cost about triple that of the cost of PRB delivered coal. These purchases will continue into the future until the railroads can demonstrate that they have the capability to perform reliably and consistently at the necessary service levels. In addition, we are considering spending millions of dollars in capital investment to accommodate the burning of higher cost alternative fuels, such as Indonesian and Colombian coal, in the long run. It's a very strange irony that we're forced to burn these types of coals at 2 to 3 times the cost, really considering the fact that America is typically referred to as the Saudi Arabia of coal. These issues are not just limited to generators relying on PRB coal, but are also issues for generators relying on sources such as Appalachian coal. One prime example of that is a generating station that helps to provide power to the Washington, D.C. metro area. In recent weeks, there have been published press reports about the Mirant Corporation adding a barge and loading terminal at the Morgantown station on the lower Potomac with the capability of bringing additional amounts of imported coal into the U.S. market. The PRB rail transportation market has changed substantially over the last few years due to inadequate investment by the railroads, maintenance problems, service failures, a lack of competition, and the resulting market power enjoyed by the railroads. While the railroads have frequently touted their increased investments in capital expenditures to their customers and investors over the last few years, and even as you have heard here today, they fail to mention the fact that the combined capital expenditure spending for UP and BNSF declined approximately 8% annually from 98 through 2002. And even despite the recent increases in UP and BNSF's combined capital expenditure, they are now just catching up to the level they were at in 1998, and that's before taking inflation into account. Further evidence that utilities have no cause for optimism concerning sustained service improvements is the fact that the railroads are now unwilling to accept responsibility for guaranteed service at any meaningful level. In general, the service performance standards in rail contracts have deteriorated substantially over time as the railroads have gained more market power and as competition has deteriorated. The railroads now have a very strong market standing in which they are in a position to dictate contract terms on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. Recent examples of discussions with railroads is concerning a contract that will expire at the end of this year. Essentially, we were told, although we haven't received a quote, that the price will go up, the cycle time commitment will increase substantially, and you can expect no meaningful service guarantees. As a direct result, now we must not only look at alternative fuel supplies, but we also have to make an investment in additional train sets in the hopes of achieving the required inventory levels. I thought it was interesting earlier today when somebody from the railroads commented that the utilities simply need to carry more inventory and not expect such a high degree of service. It's very interesting to hear this in that most utilities carry an inventory level of somewhere between 45 and 60 days. That inventory level would not have been sufficient to be able to make it through some of the disruptions we incurred in 2005. And now with the continuous degradation in service levels, I'm not quite sure how anyone expects us to build backup inventory levels when we can't even get the coal delivered based on the contractual cycle times. So it's not really as simple as it sounds. The Staggers Rail Act of 1980, which was intended to replace government regulation wherever possible with the powers of competition, granted railroads increased commercial freedom and granted the STB the authority to monitor performance and set maximum rates while minimizing federal regulatory control. It's important to note that in 1980, there were over 70 Class I railroads, whereas over the last 25 years, the nation's major railroads have consolidated to the point that the only 4 major railroads now provide 95% of all freight rail transportation in America, and only 2 of those railroads serve the Powder River Basin. While the Staggers Act may have originally promoted competition and have been considered a success at some point in time, it's clear from a utility shipper standpoint that the consolidation of the Class I carriers has gone too far and resulted in anything but a competitive marketplace. The current business model with the railroads is flawed and inconsistent with any other business model in that a monopoly is allowed to unilaterally dictate pricing and service terms with virtually no accountability or effective recourse for its customers. The board needs to revisit this model, especially in light of the critical nature of the service railroads provide to utilities and the U.S. economy. It has become painfully obvious to many utility shippers that the current situation with the railroad is out of hand, and there's little chance for improvement without the intervention of the board and or legislative changes to proactively address the issues I mentioned today. While the railroads have indicated that they are now making significant investment in infrastructure and everything is going back to normal, the fact remains that significant service problems and market-dominant pricing issues continue for many shippers, and these concerns are not being effectively addressed. Appropriate steps must be taken now to ensure that railroads have an obligation to build appropriate infrastructure to competitively and reliably serve the needs of utilities both now and in the future at reasonable rates with reasonable service guarantees and appropriate oversight by this board. We believe the board has the authority to ensure that railroads are meeting their common carrier obligations to serve their customers and have adequate infrastructure in place to meet this requirement. I believe it would be very helpful for this board to obtain more information regarding the actual service levels of the railroad in addition to some other information. As a result, EEI and Entergy are requesting that the board consider requiring detailed reporting from the railroads as it relates to energy-related service levels versus demand by region, expand the current STB railroad velocity reporting requirements to reflect primary commodity groups by corridor, track railroad force majeure claims by region. As I mentioned earlier, these are a possible indication of infrastructure problems, and also track railroad capital investment by major commodity group by region. There's a report prepared by FERC's Office of Energy Project that reports on the number of miles and throughput of natural gas pipeline construction, major pipeline projects, and LNG projects, which may provide a useful template for the board. Also, we request that the board initiate investigations into certain regions of the country where market abuse by the railroads is evident. As you are aware, the Government Accountability Office report dated October 2006 found that concerns about competition and captivity in the rail industry remain as traffic is concentrated in fewer railroads. Lastly, we request that you commit to provide a detailed report to the Congress regarding the state of the railroad industry by the end of this year to address rail competition and the service and pricing practices of the Class I railroads, as well as any inadequacies in railroad infrastructure and capacity. Thank you again for your careful consideration of these important issues.
Thank you, Mr. Moll. We'll now hear from Ms. Monceau.
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Betsy Monceau, and I appreciate the opportunity to appear before the board today for Foundation Energy Sales Incorporated, which is the sales agent for Foundation Coal, whose operating affiliates produce coal in Wyoming, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. In calendar year 2006, we sold about 74 million tons of coal, primarily to U.S. utilities for use in generating electricity. Over 3/4 of our coal is transported by rail. Thus, Foundation Coal's ability to survive and grow our business is dependent upon adequate and competitive rail transportation. Coal producers, coal consumers, and railroads are partners in serving some of the most fundamental needs of the American economy, including electricity, steel, cement, paper, and chemicals. Coal is the single largest commodity carried by the railroads, and shipments of over 7.2 million carloads in 2006 accounted for about 40% of their volume. Investments in future rail infrastructure and capacity for coal must be commensurate with the particular reliance of coal producers and consumers on the rail network and its importance as the core business commodity of the railroads. Railroads have seen sustained and accelerating traffic growth in recent years, and we've heard a lot about that today. The Class I railroads have added infrastructure, rail cars, locomotive power, and crews to handle greater volumes of business, but they have also become more selective about the business they haul. Questions remain about the ability, willingness, and obligation of railroads to handle more business. How can the railroad's common carrier obligation be reconciled against a high growth scenario that causes them to turn away business or price it so high that it will never move? Moreover, although railroads have an underlying common carrier obligation to serve in the case of coal movements, what does this obligation really mean, given that most coal movements take place under contracts? Coal accounts for about 50% of electric utility generation, and about 70% of coal deliveries to power plants are made by rail, according to the AAR. Over the past quarter century, total annual coal consumption in the U.S. has nearly doubled to approximately 1.2 billion tons in 2006, and this is expected to grow at about 1.5 to 2% annually in the future. Foundation Coal is the only U.S. producer with significant operations and major reserve blocks in both the Powder River Basin and northern Appalachia, two U.S. coal production regions for which future demand is expected to increase significantly. America today is on the verge of potentially significant coal sourcing shifts by the utility sector as implementation of additional air quality regulations occurs for emissions from electric generating plants, primarily located east of the Mississippi River. This could cause significant changes with regard to utilization of existing rail infrastructure and the need for new infrastructure. Utilities have announced plans to add technology to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions on 89,000 megawatts of coal-fired generation by 2010. This technology will largely consist of the use of scrubbers, which will require the transportation of additional raw materials such as lime and limestone into the plants and waste products such as gypsum out. With respect to coal shipments, railroads are attempting to plan for the future while utilities build scrubbers as well as new coal-fired plants and evaluate their options for future coal sourcing. Most railroads have indicated a lead time of 1 to 3 years for needed infrastructure and resource additions to adjust to significant coal sourcing shifts. The use of scrubbers at earmarked facilities will allow utilities the flexibility to take some different quality coals than they have been, and this is likely to cause some sourcing shifts among coal-producing regions. The Northern Appalachian region and the Illinois Basin, to a lesser extent, are forecast to grow due to these changes, and the routes of haul to the scrubbed facilities may be different. The Powder River Basin is also forecast to have major growth. By 2012, our internal forecast shows that total Powder River Basin coal production could increase by 100 million tons annually, or 20% above the 2006 production level of 472 million tons. Nearly all of this production will move by rail. Our internal forecast also shows that coal production from the Northern Appalachian region could increase by 20 million tons annually, or 24% above the 2006 production level of 82 million tons. We estimate that 2/3 of the 2012 Northern Appalachian production will move by rail. The combination of the current lack of meaningful excess capacity on the rails combined with sourcing changes and new coal plant additions without adequate lead time for rail infrastructure changes increases the likelihood that rail efficiency and timeliness of service will be negatively impacted. Rail tracks and yards, coal mines, and electric generating plants are all long-lived investments. Just as the railroads have fixed or sunk costs in the tracks that they lay, we have sunk investments in mining operations at fixed locations. We cannot move those operations, and in some cases we are reliant on a single railroad to ship our coal to our customers. Therefore, in addition to infrastructure, we are also concerned with competitive transportation pricing. The U.S. Class I railroads have shown they have the ability and the financial wherewithal to expend capital to add infrastructure. Although they've been spending record amounts of capital, they've also been generating record profits. And according to the CBO, the stock prices of the 4 major Class Is have outperformed the S&P 500 index for the past 5 years. The infrastructure and capacity questions and concerns for the future have to do with the locations, amounts, and timing of investments. With respect to coal, railroads need to have a good understanding of likely fuel coal sourcing and consumption patterns, but this is easier said than done due to the myriad environmental and regulatory issues facing the coal and utility industries. Nonetheless, it is imperative that coal mining companies, railroads, and utilities work together in a very deliberate way to address these issues, and time is of the essence. There are issues and many complexities with respect to who should bear the burden of America's future infrastructure needs for rails, waterways, and roads, and the public benefits must be adequately captured in assessments of such. Innovation and open-mindedness with respect to ways to achieve added infrastructure and capacity needs will be required, as will more private and public coordination. And consensus-building efforts need to be made toward the development of a comprehensive national transportation policy. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Ms. Monsu. We'll now turn to Mr. Thomas C. Cantor. Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, I'm Tom Cantor. I'm the Executive Director of the National Coal Transportation Association. Our membership consists of over 130 members that are primarily electric utilities, but coal producers, and also rail product suppliers and rail service suppliers. Our mission is to provide education to our membership as well as the general public, and also a second part of our mission is to help resolve problems and issues that would come into the coal transportation structure. And that's not only rail, but that's also water, and in some cases trucking. It's also part of my mission here today not to contradict any of my three members that have testified here before me, and I have no need to do so, as we agree. And so I'll be very brief and not try to reiterate everything that has been said. I will say that I'll address the current capacity in coal. And I think there's where we have a true consensus. I've heard some bogus consensus here in the last week, 2 weeks, several months about global climate change, and it's all consensus worldwide, et cetera. But I think we truly have a consensus here that we need rail capacity and that it's important to this nation. But I also agree with Jim Young from earlier today that rail capacity is more than iron in the ground. Our membership has invested large sums of money in terms of mine loadouts, allowing the railroads to minimize their time under the tipples. The utility private car investment, if it were to be replaced today just from our membership with 80,000 cars at today's prices, is probably $5 billion of investment. Each landing spot that the mining companies are being asked to put in is about $2 million for 1.5 miles of track. And you know, that's been a good investment from certain standpoints of the private cars because, as Mr. Mole pointed out, and I believe Gary did as well, that we're seeing a time here of increasing cycle time. And if the average velocity went from 26 miles to 21 miles in the west, and for both railroads roughly, and yet we're hauling 100 million tons more coal than we did about 10 years ago, it must be coming in from the investment of the utilities and the miners that has been very productive. The cost of insufficient capacity was alluded to by Mr. Mole. I think on a nationwide basis in the 2005-2006 failure to deliver episode, we probably had about 30 million tons of undelivered demand based on the forecasts that were reasonable in 2005. And if that were to equate on a BTU basis and you had to utilize your shoulder and your peak natural gas generation, of course not all of it was, some of it was imported coal, we'd be looking at about $5 billion of cost to the nation's economy just for that 1 year in an episode. And it also caused Grandma Olson to be a little colder up in northern Minnesota just because of the price of natural gas going up, and it was already high to start with. So I think we all agree that insufficient capacity does have costs, and I just tried to put some kind of a number from a national basis. Finally, it's a cheap way, I think. Talk is cheap, but there's a cheap way in terms of communications to give ourselves capacity. We have been using a logistics and planning committee and a forecasting committee that has railroads as standing members. This is in the West because it's easier to do on the joint line. They had a slotting requirement to work amongst themselves, and we were able to help them in that regard. And we have monthly teleconference calls. And we went from a situation in 1999 of constructive placement to today, or just last week, or this week's phone call, we were within 0.3% of a non-existent gap between the utilities and the coal producers. Now, we will not deliver all the demand that's forecasted. Unfortunately, we'll probably miss it by about 20 million tons again this year in the PRB. In the East, we have a greater problem because of the complexity of the system. We would ask that the STB might help us either through the Department of Transportation or some other grouping, because we do not have the freedom to provide data in front of each other and to have the two railroads aggregated because they don't have a joint line type situation. So we'd ask you to consider some way that we can, in the East, for the particularly Norfolk Southern CSX, to get data that they need to properly allocate additional capacity in the East. And with that, I will close.
Thank you, Mr. Cantor. We'll now proceed with Mr. Full and Mr. Crowley. All righty. Gotcha.
Good afternoon. My name is Peter Full. I'm with the law firm of Slover and Loftus, and with me today is Tom Crowley, who's with the economic consulting firm of L.E. Peabody and Associates. And we're here today on behalf of the Western Coal Traffic League, which is a group of 18 electric utilities that collectively move approximately 140 million tons of Western coal by rail annually. The subject of this hearing is very important to the Coal League members who rely on the railroads to have in place adequate systems to help ensure the timely movement of coal that meets their requirements and ensures electric system reliability. Mr. Crowley and I appear here today to summarize the Coal League's written statement and answer any of your questions. I will start, and I will then turn to Mr. Crowley periodically during our time to summarize some of the economic analysis that he conducted for the League. The board requested public comments in 5 areas. The first was freight traffic forecasts. On this subject, WCTL asked Mr. Crowley to prepare traffic growth summaries for the Western railroads, and his analysis is contained in 2 slides.
This slide compares the growth in combined UP and BNF traffic over the last 7 years for the railroad's intermodal and coal traffic and other traffic groups. This data demonstrates that while the UP and BNSF's combined coal traffic has increased by nearly 20% in total over the last 7 years, the real growth in railroad traffic has come from the Western carriers' intermodal traffic. The railroad stated numerous times in the recent past that they need future investments to support coal and manifest traffic, but based on the railroad's recent historical traffic patterns, it is the increase in intermodal traffic that is driving the perception of a capacity shortage on the railroads. The fact that coal traffic has grown on average by 3% a year was not unforeseen by the Western railroads. EIA, an arm of the United States Department of Energy, produces on an annual basis 25-year forecast of future coal production from all United States major coal fields, including Southern PRB. This slide displays the growth in actual Southern PRB coal production through 2006 as reported by the state of Wyoming and EIA's current projection of future PRB coal production. As is clearly evident, Southern PRB coal production has increased at a relatively steady pace over the last 11 years. More importantly, not once during that period did Southern PRB coal production decline from the prior year. The EIA and other forecasting firms all expect PRB coal production to continue to increase at a relatively same steady pace into the future. The railroads have ready access to this information, and the past and future growth in PRB coal production should be no surprise to them.
Thus, coal traffic demand really has been strong but steady, and there's been no demand spikes in Western coal traffic. The railroads have been well positioned to plan for and make in a timely manner all the necessary investments required to meet their coal customers' demands. Let me also mention here that UP's testimony that they presented to the board stresses that planning and resource problems it may be experiencing with its manifest business have created additional capacity problems for it. There aren't such problems with coal traffic. Coal unit train service is the railroad's most efficient business,